I never called him back. That's how George Benson begins his confession at 82, his voice quiet, shaking, as if the weight of a single sentence had taken 4 decades to leave his throat. But who was he talking about? Why now? And why had he kept that silence for so long? This is not the story of 2 jazz legends coming together. It's the story of what tore them apart. Because behind the glossy studio photos and Grammy-winning melodies was a deeper, colder truth. One of artistic betrayal, quiet erasure, and a friendship that never truly began. What really happened between George Benson and Earl Klugh? And why did one of the most celebrated partnerships in jazz history vanish without a trace? It begins not with a betrayal, but with a melody. In 1979, 2 virtuosos sat across from one another in a dimly lit studio. One, a smooth-talking, swaggering showman from Pittsburgh, George Benson, already a household name. The other, a soft-spoken prodigy from Detroit, Earl Klugh, barely 30 and yet capable of making a guitar weep like a human soul. Together, they recorded Collaboration, an album so seamlessly beautiful that even critics who'd dismissed smooth jazz as commercial fluff had to take notice. It was not just music, it was harmony, on record, and, it seemed, in life. But something happened behind those sessions, something that left a silence louder than applause. To understand the wound that still seems to throb in George Benson's voice at 82, we need to go back decades, before the Grammys, before the gold records, before the smiles on album covers that masked the truth. We need to return to a time when jazz was not yet a market, but a movement, and where young black musicians had to fight not just for recognition, but for ownership of their craft. Benson's rise was meteoric. Discovered in the early 60s as a teenage phenom, he was mentored by the legendary organist Jack McDuff, and quickly made a name for himself with his dazzling speed and soul-infused phrasing. But Benson wasn't content to remain a musician's musician. By the mid-1970s, he'd pivoted, adding vocals, courting crossover appeal, and landing massive radio hits like This Masquerade and Give Me the Night. It was a savvy move, one that earned him riches and ridicule in equal measure. Purists turned their backs, but the public? They couldn't get enough. Klugh, by contrast, was a quiet storm. A classically trained fingerstyle guitarist with an ear for Brazilian rhythms and soft melodies, he found his audience in the calm between genres. He wasn't chasing fame. Fame found him. He was invited to play on albums with Quincy Jones, Stevie Wonder, and yes, George Benson. Their chemistry was immediate. Benson's sharp, bluesy flair met Klugh's gentle precision, like flint meeting silk. On paper, they were opposites. On tape, they were magic. And that's where the deception begins. Because collaboration was not just a commercial endeavor. For Klugh, it was a personal turning point. He believed it was the beginning of a partnership, a true artistic union that would endure. Benson, however, may have seen something else entirely, a stepping stone. In early interviews promoting the album, Benson spoke glowingly of Klugh, calling him the future, a genius, a brother. Klugh, in return, seemed genuinely awed to be working with someone he'd grown up admiring. Yet behind closed doors, there were already signs that the harmony was brittle. Session musicians whispered about creative control, about who was really leading, about disagreements over composition credits and arrangements. Klugh had written several key tracks, but only one bore his name alone. The record soared. It topped jazz charts, earned Grammy buzz, and spawned tours. But there would be no follow-up, no second album, no joint interviews after the whirlwind press cycle. When asked years later why they never collaborated again, both men offered vague answers. Timing, schedules, different directions. none of it rang true. Because while Klugh continued quietly building his solo discography, Benson exploded into pop superstardom. He won more Grammys, headlined more festivals. His name was etched into the Mount Rushmore of guitar greats. And through it all, Klugh's contributions were barely mentioned, except as a footnote to a collaboration that had seemingly meant the world to him. So why, in 2025, is Benson finally talking? And why now, at 82, is he naming Earl Klugh in the same breath as regret? They were, for a brief moment, jazz royalty. The late 70s and early 80s were not kind to traditional jazz. Fusion dominated, disco encroached, and many of the genre's giants had either faded from public consciousness or passed on. But into that vacuum stepped a new kind of musician, slick, polished, media-savvy, and George Benson was king among them. By the time he met Earl Klugh, Benson had already transcended jazz entirely. His albums went platinum. He toured with Quincy. He played the White House. He was no longer just a guitarist. He was a brand. And with each radio-friendly hit, he widened the gap between himself and the purists who once celebrated his raw, bebop brilliance. Klugh, though younger, was on a parallel path. His 1976 album, Living Inside Your Love, had achieved crossover success, and his style, melodic, warm, cinematic, was perfectly suited for the emerging adult contemporary market. He was the kind of artist who could charm your mother, your dentist, and your local jazz station DJ in the same week. There was a sheen to his work, a softness that masked its complexity. The industry took notice, and it didn't take long before labels, agents, and producers began whispering, a George Benson-Earl Klugh joint album would print money. At first, it seemed like a match made in heaven. Their management teams aligned. A-list producers signed on. The album was greenlit, and for a time, the two men genuinely seemed to bond. They shared stories, traded licks, and even joked in interviews about touring together until our fingers fall off. But beneath the surface, tensions were already brewing. Benson was used to control. In every project, every recording session, he called the shots. He had final say on mixes, marketing, even track order. Klugh, though quieter, was no less meticulous. He'd built his reputation on nuance, on subtle harmonic changes, delicate timing, restraint. And as they entered the studio, it became clear. Two visions were about to collide. Sources close to the sessions described a subtle power struggle. Klugh would suggest a tempo change. Benson would dismiss it. Benson would want a flashy solo. Klugh would argue for minimalism. These weren't shouting matches. They were colder, professional, disguised as artistic disagreements. But they left a mark. Still, the album got made, and it was beautiful. Collaboration wasn't just a commercial hit. It was a critical triumph. It showcased what jazz could be when it married sophistication with soul. Tracks like Dreamin' and Mimosa became instant classics. But behind every note, there was a growing divide. And then came the tour. Short. Tense. Behind the stage curtain, something cracked. Some say Benson was approached with a solo deal mid-tour that he didn't tell Klugh about. Others claim Klugh refused a second album, feeling creatively stifled. The truth? No one knows. But after that final show, they never performed together again. And from that moment on, they never mentioned each other again in public, until now. George Benson has always been a master of performance, not just musically, but personally. On stage, he could light up a room with effortless charm. In interviews, he was gracious, affable, funny. But beneath the smiles, there was always a calculating mind. He had survived and thrived in an industry that chews up talent and spits out shadows. And that survival came at a cost. To Benson, music was more than art. It was a career, a legacy, a business. For Earl Klugh, it was something more fragile. In a rare 1991 interview, Klugh was asked about collaboration. His response was striking in its economy. "It was a good time. I learned a lot." When pressed on why there was no follow-up, he only smiled and said, "Sometimes once is enough." There was no bitterness, no sarcasm, just a quiet closing of the door. But privately, those who knew Klugh said he was hurt. Not by the album, not even by the disagreements, but by the silence that followed. Benson never called, never acknowledged his influence, never spoke his name. And for Klugh, that silence felt like erasure. Because collaboration wasn't just a record, it was his dream, an artistic handshake between equals. To discover, years later, that he'd been viewed as a supporting act in his own mind's masterpiece, that was the true betrayal. For Benson, the album was a business decision. For Klugh, it was a bond. Now, decades later, in a dimly lit podcast studio, George Benson, older, slower, his voice raspier, finally utters the words no one expected. "I should have treated Earl better." Why now? And what other truths has he kept buried all these years? Chapter 4. The Studio Silence. By the early 1980s, George Benson had become untouchable. He was no longer the kid from Pittsburgh hustling for gigs. He was a household name, sitting atop a throne built from platinum records and sold-out tours. While other jazz musicians struggled to remain relevant in a pop-saturated landscape, Benson had done the impossible. He'd crossed over. And with every chart-topping hit, he tightened his grip on an industry that now saw jazz not as resistance, but as revenue. But for all the interviews, the accolades, and the roaring applause, there was one name that rarely, if ever, passed his lips again. Earl Klugh. Not in interviews, not in liner notes, not on stage. The silence wasn't just suspicious, it was deafening. At first, fans chalked it up to career logistics. They're both busy. Different directions. Creative evolution. But those excuses wore thin as the years dragged on. Klugh continued releasing albums, crafting delicate masterpieces that blended classical elegance with jazz intuition. Yet when journalists brought up Benson, Klugh's responses turned increasingly evasive. One interview, buried in the pages of a niche jazz magazine from 1997, stands out. When asked about a possible reunion with Benson, Klugh paused, then offered only this: "Some collaborations are beautiful because they're brief. You don't want to revisit something that wasn't built to last." He didn't elaborate. Behind closed doors, insiders told a different story. Studio engineers who had worked with both men described two artists with polar opposite philosophies. Klugh, intensely private, labored over every note, every arrangement. Benson, confident and instinctual, believed in momentum. He'd knock out sessions in hours, preferring feel over perfection. During the collaboration sessions, this philosophical divide caused constant friction. Klugh would request second takes. Benson would shrug them off. Producers were forced to play mediator. But it wasn't just creative tension. It was ego and ownership. Klugh had written several foundational tracks for the album, but Benson's name dominated the credits. In promotional materials, his photo was centered, larger. His name came first. The implication was clear. This was Benson's project, and Klugh was the guest, even when he wasn't. To the public, it seemed unremarkable, but to those who knew Klugh's temperament, it cut deep. He wasn't in it for the fame. He was in it for respect. And what he got, instead, was an education in industry politics. By the time the album won critical acclaim, the relationship had already fractured. There were no follow-up meetings, no debriefs, not even a thank you call. And in the years that followed, Benson would continue ascending, appearing at award shows, collaborating with big names like Al Jarreau and Quincy Jones, while Klugh quietly receded from the spotlight, focusing on small ensemble tours and intimate solo work. It wasn't a disappearance, it was a withdrawal. One man leaned into celebrity, the other retreated into silence. But silence, like music, is never neutral. It either soothes or it condemns. And in this case, it said everything. By the 2000s, jazz had splintered. The golden era was gone, and the genre lived in fragmented subcultures, academic circles, nostalgia cruises, late-night radio slots. Yet among aficionados, whispers of the Benson-Klugh divide remained. Forums speculated. Reddit threads dissected old interviews. Bootleg recordings from their final tour were passed around like artifacts from a fallen empire. But one question remained. Why did they never speak about it? For years, Klugh avoided the spotlight. Though he continued releasing music, he rarely gave interviews. He never lashed out, never accused, never retaliated. But he also never forgot. Friends close to Klugh recall a turning point in the early 2000s when he was invited to a tribute concert honoring Benson's legacy. The event featured a star-studded lineup: Herbie Hancock, Pat Metheny, even Stevie Wonder. Klugh's name was noticeably absent from the bill, and when asked privately if he'd been invited, his response was ice cold. "I suppose they forgot who helped build that legacy." It was the closest he ever came to bitterness. Meanwhile, Benson continued crafting his mythos. Autobiographies, documentaries, and retrospective interviews painted him as a visionary, one who broke barriers and defied genre constraints. He was generous in praise for his influences, Wes Montgomery, Charlie Christian, but when it came to his peers, particularly those who shared the spotlight during his rise, his memory grew selective. Klugh wasn't just forgotten, he was erased. And it wasn't just about ego, it was about power. The industry thrives on narratives, and Benson's narrative had no room for equals. Only successors, only fans. But the betrayal ran deeper than press kits or tribute snubs. It lived in the core of what collaboration represented. For Klugh, it was never a business transaction. It was a statement that two black men, both prodigiously gifted, could join forces and create something transcendent, something bigger than either of them. Instead, he was commodified, marketed as the softer counterpart to Benson's Flash. And when the campaign ended, he was discarded like a spent prop. Years later, during a rare backstage moment caught on tape, a fellow musician asked Klugh if he'd ever play with Benson again. Klugh's response was quiet but chilling. "I don't play for applause anymore. I play for peace. And some people, they take that from you." The betrayal wasn't public. It was private. And that made it permanent. It would take another 2 decades before the silence was finally broken. In the summer of 2025, George Benson appeared on a jazz-focused podcast, Strings Attached, hosted by one of his former bandmates. It was meant to be a light-hearted, retrospective conversation. But about 47 minutes in, the tone shifted. The host brought up collaboration. Benson visibly paused. Then, after a long breath, he said it. "You know, I never told Earl how much that album meant to me. I let the business get in the way of the brotherhood. That's on me." The internet exploded. Clips of the interview went viral. Musicians, fans, and critics alike flooded the comments. Some praised Benson's honesty. Others questioned the timing. Why now? Why, after decades of omission, was he finally speaking Earl Klugh's name? The answer may lie not in Benson's conscience, but in his mortality. At 82, Benson has nothing left to prove. The accolades are secure. The legacy is carved in granite. But perhaps, in the quiet of old age, Surrounded by walls of gold records and echoes of missed phone calls, he heard something else, the sound of a debt unpaid. What he didn't say, however, was more revealing. He didn't apologize. He didn't name the disagreements. He didn't explain the silence. He merely acknowledged that it existed. Klugh, for his part, has yet to respond. Some believe he won't. Others hope for a reconciliation, but those close to him say it's unlikely. The wounds are too old, the silence too loud, and in that silence the rift remains, unspoken, unhealed. Two legends, one record, and a lifetime of distance. What happens when harmony is broken? Not musically, but spiritually. And what if some chords can never be played again? It was supposed to be a night of celebration. In early 2010, George Benson was inducted into the Jazz Hall of Fame. The ceremony was broadcast live from New York City's Lincoln Center, and the audience was filled with music legends: Herbie Hancock, Diana Krall, Wynton Marsalis, and a constellation of young protégés who owed their careers to Benson's groundbreaking fusion of jazz and soul. The tribute performances were dazzling. A choir sang "The Greatest Love of All." A young guitarist played Breezen note for note, mimicking Benson's famously fluid licks. The final act was a sweeping medley spanning 4 decades of Benson's work, backed by a full orchestra and narrated by Quincy Jones. But amid the glowing accolades, the video montages, the standing ovations, there was one glaring omission. Not a single mention of collaboration. Not a single image of Earl Klugh. Not a single note from the album that had, for many, marked the pinnacle of Benson's musical maturity. It wasn't just a curious oversight. It was deliberate. Producers later admitted that Klugh had been considered for inclusion in the retrospective segment, but was ultimately deprioritized due to limited runtime and creative focus on Benson's solo legacy. In the world of public relations, that's code for something else: erasure. The omission sent ripples through the jazz community. Forums lit up. Jazz critics tweeted pointed observations. Some called it a travesty, others a missed opportunity. One op-ed in Downbeat magazine stated it plainly: "You can't tell the full story of George Benson without telling the story of Earl Klugh. And if you do, it's not a story. It's a fiction." But to Klugh, it was nothing new. He had watched, over the years, as collaboration faded from public memory. Despite its enduring fan base and influence, it was rarely included in retrospectives, streaming playlists, or official Benson discographies. Interviews with Benson glossed over it, lumping it in with experimental side projects. Documentaries gave it seconds of screen time, if that. The name that had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Benson's on that 1979 cover had become a ghost. For Klugh, the silence was never just professional. It was deeply personal. He had never expected the fame Benson chased, but he had expected acknowledgement. Not applause, not headlines, just truth. And yet, each year, as Benson's image grew larger than life, Klugh's presence in that narrative grew smaller, until it vanished altogether. In private, Klugh remained graceful. Friends said he would occasionally revisit collaboration, not to dwell on betrayal, but to remember what was real: the music, the interplay, the brief, shimmering window when two artists, so different yet so aligned, had created something timeless. But with every award Benson accepted, every televised special, every biography published without Klugh's name, the damage compounded. The story was being rewritten, and the price of omission wasn't just historical accuracy, it was justice. Because erasure is a quiet violence. It doesn't need fanfare, it just needs complicity. And as the world celebrated one man's rise, it silently buried another's contribution. In the quiet years that followed, Earl Klugh drifted further into solitude. He never stopped making music, but his releases became sporadic. His tours were smaller, more intimate, often unannounced, sometimes acoustic only. He stopped doing press altogether. The man who had once stood beside George Benson on the cover of a platinum-selling album became a recluse by choice, not by force. Some chalked it up to age. Others speculated about illness or artistic fatigue. But those who knew Klugh understood. It wasn't about burnout. It was about boundaries. After collaboration, Klugh had poured himself into solo work that received quiet critical praise but little commercial attention. Albums like Whispers and Promises and Naked Guitar showed a maturing artist deepening his sound, stripping away excess in search of something purer. But despite his undeniable talent, the spotlight rarely found him again. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because he refused to chase it. And yet, even in his isolation, the shadow of Benson loomed. At jazz festivals, their names would sometimes appear on the same lineup, but never on the same day. At award shows, Klugh was often seated rows behind the main stage, his presence acknowledged, but never emphasized. He didn't seem to mind, at least not outwardly. But a telling moment occurred during a 2014 tribute concert to smooth jazz pioneers. Klugh was slated to perform a solo set. The producers suggested closing with a duet, perhaps one of the hits from collaboration. Klugh declined. When pressed, he offered only this: "That song belongs to a time I don't return to." It wasn't anger, it was resignation. Avoidance had become survival. Meanwhile, Benson continued to dominate the jazz conversation. His memoir, Breezin', My Life in Music, was released in 2017. In its 300 pages, collaboration was mentioned once. One sentence, no commentary, no reflection. Klugh's name didn't even appear in the index. When asked at a book signing if he still spoke to Klugh, Benson smiled and said, "We had a great run. Life moves on." But Klugh hadn't moved on. He'd merely stepped aside. There's a kind of grief that comes not from loss, but from ongoing disconnection. From knowing someone you once respected, once admired, once trusted, has chosen a different path, one that leaves you behind. That grief doesn't explode. It accumulates. And for Klugh, it showed in the music. His later works were more introspective, more melancholy. He played slower, softer, as if trying to coax something out of the silence that surrounded him. He wasn't avoiding Benson. He was avoiding the pain that came with remembering him. And that avoidance? It became his refuge. When George Benson sat down for that podcast in June 2025, no one expected a revelation. The episode had been scheduled months in advance. The hosts, a pair of younger jazz musicians, intended it to be a nostalgic ride through Benson's career, a celebration of his influence. And for the first hour, it was just that. Stories about Wes Montgomery, tales of touring with Miles Davis, light-hearted jabs at modern pop. But around the 62-minute mark, the tone shifted. One of the hosts, clearly nervous, broached the subject no one had dared ask Benson directly in decades. "You know, George, there's a lot of fans who still talk about collaboration. Do you ever think about Earl? About that time?" There was a pause, a long one. Benson leaned back. His eyes, normally quick with humor, seemed suddenly far away. "I think about Earl all the time," he said. Another pause. "I didn't handle that right. I should have called him. Should have made it right. That album wasn't just a session. It was real, and I treated it like business." The room was silent. "I got caught up in the climb," he continued. "The awards, the meetings, the money. And I left something behind. Someone." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest he'd ever come. The hosts, stunned, offered him space to continue. He didn't. The episode ended not with laughter or applause, but with a quote from Benson himself. "Sometimes, the notes you don't play, those are the ones that haunt you." Within 48 hours, the clip went viral. The jazz world erupted. Some hailed it as a long-overdue reckoning. Others called it performative. "Too little, too late," one headline read. Another asked bluntly, "Where was this confession when it mattered?" But Klugh? He remained silent. Friends say he watched the clip, alone, said nothing. Whether it brought him peace, pain, or something in between, no one knows. But for Benson, the confession marked a shift. In the weeks that followed, he mentioned Klugh more frequently, dedicated a performance of Breezin' to him at the Montreux Jazz Festival, even hinted at writing a letter. But the damage had been done. The decades of silence, the decades of avoidance, could not be undone with a single sentence. Still, it meant something. Because for the first time, the name Earl Klugh was no longer missing. It was spoken. And sometimes, that's where healing begins. Not with forgiveness, but with truth. In the months following his confession, George Benson made several public gestures, tributes, interviews, even a brief written statement in a jazz magazine honoring Earl Klugh's unmatched grace and musicality. For the first time in over 40 years, collaboration was reissued on streaming platforms with remastered audio and liner notes that included both artists' full contributions. Critics applauded the move. Fans rejoiced. Think pieces flooded the internet, many proclaiming that the long-standing wound in jazz history had finally begun to heal. But the truth? Healing doesn't come from digital reissues. It comes from accountability. And for that, it was already too late. Earl Klugh, now in his early 70s, declined all interview requests. He didn't attend the re-release event in Los Angeles. He gave no statement, no rebuttal, no acceptance. He simply disappeared back into the quiet where he'd stayed for years. Some sources close to Klugh said he appreciated Benson's words, but others weren't so certain. "Appreciation isn't reconciliation," one longtime friend said. "It's recognition. And that's a very different thing when you've been ignored for decades." The damage wasn't just professional, it was existential. Because while George Benson's legacy is cemented in the architecture of modern jazz, Earl Klugh's influence lives in the shadows. Echoes without credit, melodies without names. The soft harmonies he helped shape have been absorbed into the genre's DNA, but the name behind them? Faded. Omitted. Even today, documentaries about smooth jazz rarely mention him. His innovations in fingerstyle technique are often attributed to others. Younger musicians sample his textures without knowing the origin. It is the cruelest kind of fame, the invisible kind. And that's the final tragedy of this story. Not that two men grew apart, not that egos clashed, but that one man walked away with the crown while the other disappeared into the footnotes of someone else's biography. There are still those who hope for a reunion, a final concert, a joint interview, a closing chapter to the story that began with such musical promise. But as time dwindles, that dream feels more like fiction than future. Because some bridges, when left unattended for too long, don't just burn, they collapse. And all that's left are the ruins and the haunting melodies of what might have been. One rose to glory, the other faded in silence, but between them lies a record that still echoes with genius and betrayal. What is legacy if it forgets the ones who built it? Comment below. Subscribe for more hidden stories. And remember, history doesn't just remember what's said, it remembers what was left unsaid.